Okay, folks. Bartlett, New Hampshire, Derry, New Hampshire, Salt Lake City, Philadelphia, Santa Monica. What was I reading about Santa Monica lately? Something interesting. Boulder, Colorado, Crystal Lake, Illinois. Um, was that Little Rock? I have such a soft spot in my heart for Little Rock, Arkansas. I made a wish in Little Rock, Arkansas. I threw a quarter into that famous fountain you have, and the wish came true. Kansas, terrible, awful, no good day. Absolutely. What we're doing here right now is waiting for Facebook to come on because they come on a little bit after you all do. Wichita, Kansas, Cape Cod, Mass. I hope it's beautiful there. We lost our power for the middle of the day because we had so many storms going through here. Nashville, dream someday to get to the Grand Ole Opry. And Facebook, somebody said Facebook is on. I'm not seeing it yet. Do I trust you or do I wait to see the little F come up? Come on, my Facebook peeps, come on up. Show me where you are. Hey, Janet, how are you? Canada. Must be beautiful up there right now. Knoxville, lots of, oh, there we go. Facebook is on. Hi, folks. Terrific. So yeah, let me start and where you expect me to today. I didn't ask for questions today because I was pretty sure where people would want me to go. Today, the House of Representatives passed the budget reconciliation bill. This was written in the cards really in November when the Republicans picked up the House, the Senate, and the presidency, that they were going to push through something this heinous, really. So I know, it felt like a roller coaster when it seemed like the Senate might stand against it, or it seemed like the House might stand against it. They did have a majority and they passed a ton of stuff through under what is called budget reconciliation. So they could do so with a simple majority. The Democrats in the Senate couldn't stand against it. And, just to be clear here, the Democrats really did do the best they could to slow it down, to drag it out. One of the reasons that Hakeem Jeffries talked today for 8 hours and 45 minutes, the longest speech in the House, was because he was trying to make sure that the vote wasn't taken in the middle of the night the way that the Republicans wanted for it to be. I believe they convened at around 3 o'clock in the morning to do this vote. So we, as disappointing as it is, the Democrats put up a good fight against it, and it is what it is. We knew it was going to pass, and it did pass. So let me outline what that means in a bunch of different ways. The first thing to note is that it is a very long bill. It's about 900 and something pages. And there's a lot of material in that a lot of people hate. That's important because, one of the things we learned yesterday when Donald Trump had a number of the House Republican holdouts come to the White House to talk to him about the bill is that he did not appear to know that the bill cuts Medicaid. Because the Republicans have been screaming that it doesn't cut Medicaid. They have been trying to say that they're only attacking waste, fraud, and abuse. But we know there is virtually no waste, fraud, and abuse among the users of Medicaid. The place where fraud comes into play is among the people who are scamming the system, who own the other side of it, people like Rick Scott in the Senate, who has paid, I think, what is still the largest penalty for scamming, not Medicaid. I think it was Medicare. But the point is, it's not the individuals who are scamming Medicaid. It's the corporations that are doing it. So even Trump recognized that that this would be enormously unpopular. And there are a number of things in the bill that there's a lot to hate, like I say. And the reason that that's important right now is because the Republican Party is divided over this bill. They pushed it through. They did what Trump wanted them to do for a number of reasons, I think. There are some people who are true believers, and I'll talk more about them in a minute. There are some people who are afraid either of their constituents or of Trump. I think probably, and maybe this is because I'm just a Pollyanna, but I think there are probably a lot of people who were just hoping that somebody else would take care of the problem. And I think you saw that with people like Lisa Murkowski, who gave a yes vote in the Senate for all the wrong reasons and seemed to hope that the House would bail her out. And of course they didn't, because everybody was hoping that somebody else would bail them out. So it's important to remember that in this really, well, they're calling it while the Republicans have a name for it that has since been changed. The official name of the bill was originally the One Big Beautiful Bill, which they literally named it that. Chuck Schumer insisted they change that name in the Senate, and they did. I don't know what it's called now, but it is also being called by the people who hate it the MAGA murder bill. And that's not inaccurate, because a lot of people are going to die because of this bill. But it's important to remember that the Republicans themselves are divided about it because it is so incredibly unpopular. And they would not have voted on it in the middle of the night, taken it up in the middle of the night, tried to hide what was in it, lied about what's in it, had they thought there was anything good in the bill. And that's going to be important to remember, because this is now the signature piece of legislation of the Republicans in the 21st century. And that's, I don't think it's going to play terribly well. So let me tell you what is in the bill, a little bit of what's in the bill that is unpopular. First of all, you've heard, I assume, that it cuts taxes for the wealthy, significantly cuts taxes for the wealthy and for corporations. And the Republicans tried to get around that by saying, oh, they're only continuing the tax cuts that Trump put in and the Congress put in under Trump in 2017. We're currently living under that, so that doesn't change things. That's an entirely new and unprecedented way to score the cost of a bill. And the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says that this bill will add at least 3.3 trillion with a T dollars to the debt over the next 10 years. And the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian institute, estimates that number could be 6 trillion to $10 trillion. This is essentially unsustainable. So the next time any Republican says they're trying to cut back on the national debt or on the national deficit, you can laugh in their face, because this is a debt and deficit buster like we have never seen before. Remember, a deficit is the annual difference between the amount of money that the federal government takes in revenue and the amount it pays out in appropriations or in debt servicing and so on. That's the deficit. The debt is the accumulation of that. And they are calculated differently because the debt has to be financed. So and it's just like borrowing to pay a credit card, and you have to pay interest on it. So the debt that is added is more than the deficit that is added, simply the same way that carrying a debt is. And what we are doing then under this bill is we are increasing the debt ceiling, allowing the country to borrow a lot more money in order to cut taxes for the extremely wealthy and for corporations. So we're borrowing money as a nation in order to give it to the very wealthy. The other thing that is in this bill is almost law now. It's been passed by both houses. It is now going to be signed. I'll tell you more about that in a second, by President Trump. But the other thing, of course, are dramatic cuts to the social safety net in the United States, which was already really weak compared to most trade-based democratic nations. So Medicaid will lose, I believe it's $890 billion with a B dollars over the next, it's either 5 or 10 years. I don't remember off the top of my head. Now, if you look at that measure, it is designed to go into effect after the midterms. So the tax cuts are immediate, but the cuts to the social service programs are designed to go into effect after the midterms. But in fact, because hospitals and nursing homes and so on need to do their budgets years in advance, the cuts will start earlier than that. They will have to start downsizing. And we've already, since the bill passed today, lost one clinic, which said we just know we can't stay open. I don't remember now where that was. So although those cuts won't go into play for about 18 months, in fact, they are we're going to start to see some of the cuts earlier than that. There are also dramatic cuts to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the SNAP program, which helps especially children around the country. In some states, the rate of SNAP use can be as high as 20% of the children in that state. Usually it's more like 16%. That's a lot of children who are no longer going to have supplemental nutrition assistance. And it's not much money for each person that's on SNAP. And then the other thing that the bill does in the cuts is it cuts the energy tax credits so that we're helping the United States to switch to electric vehicles and solar power and wind power, and instead gives a boost to fossil fuels, the fossil fuels that are contributing to climate change. And that this will, people who are interested in climate activism or in addressing the climate, the issues that we have, are really very concerned about the fact the U.S. under President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris made a big leap forward in trying to bring the United States, along with other countries, to switching into renewable energy. We will now jump backward and will be contributing instead to the further use of fossil fuels in the United States. So that is also in the bill. The other thing that is in this law, soon to be law, is something that got a lot less attention than those other pieces, although plenty of people were still talking about it. And that's that for all the cuts that it makes to the social welfare system in the United States, and I only gave you a handful of them, it does in fact increase funding for deportation, detention facilities for migrants, and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, by $170.7 billion. What that money does is it makes ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, those agents who have their faces covered and are rounding up people off the streets, the highest funded federal law enforcement agency in the United States in history. It has more money at its disposal over the next 4 years than the budgets of the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Agency, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or ATF, the U.S. Marshals, and the Bureau of Prisons combined. That money is designed to give about $51.6 billion to build a wall on the border. That's more than 3 times what Trump spent in his first term on the wall. It provides $45 billion for detention facilities for ICE. And that's an increase of about 265% in ICE's annual detention budget. And it provides about $30 billion for ICE enforcement. That's a threefold increase in ICE's annual budget, and will allow ICE to hire about 19,000 more agents. As you know, in the last week in Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis, a Republican, of course, has opened a detention facility for migrants in the Everglades for between 3,000 and 5,000 migrants there in the Everglades. And the facilities are tents with cages in them that are susceptible to rain and heat, of course, to flooding and heat. And Trump has said that they will build many more of those across the country, and that he is interested not only in deporting or imprisoning what he calls criminals, although about 8% of the undocumented migrants that ICE is picking up are have actually been convicted of a crime. The rest of them have not, and so it's a little hard to see this hellscape that Trump keeps describing. But Trump is also saying that he wants to get rid of what he calls the homegrowns, that is, people in the United States citizens who he claims are criminals. And it is worth remembering, of course, that he has defined people who worked in his last administration as people who could be traitors, could be charged with treason because they spoke out against him. So I think you really have to look at this measure that is about to be signed into law and recognize that what it does is it creates a police force that is answers only to the executive branch. And I won't say to Trump here, because I actually don't think he's calling the shots on immigration. I think that's Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, and to some degree Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, that and the advisor that Trump has, who has no, by the way, political power. He's simply an advisor. That's Holman, that they call the border czar, but really all he is an advisor. I think they're the ones really calling the shots on this. But this is going to be a huge police force designed to round up Americans and put them in detention camps. And I just here quickly wanted to make sure you understand what a concentration camp is. It is literally a place where people are concentrated. I can tell you the history of them, which is actually quite interesting and has a lot to do with American history, but where people are concentrated without due process of law. They tend to be either members of persecuted minorities or political prisoners, and they are deliberately imprisoned in a very small area without adequate facilities to support them. So, and it's worth thinking of that in light of the fact as well that we have now, as of 2 days ago, I think, I lose track of time, the paperwork from Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was rendered, not deported, because he didn't, well, in his case, actually was from El Salvador, but he was rendered to prison in El Salvador against the wishes and against the orders of the US courts. And he was tortured there. He has written, you can find it online if you're interested. He wrote about the beatings and the sleep deprivation and, the things that he endured at Seacott prison. And in fact, he is currently, at his own request, being held in prison out of concern that the US government will render him back there if he is out of federal prison, which is just a crazy thing, that somebody is preferring to be in prison than face the US government. All of that is the background to this bill. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how I think we got here ideologically, because, and I will tell you about the history behind where we are right now, but I think it's important to recognize that there is an ideology behind this this bill and behind the MAGA Republicans that is part of America. It's one that has ruled us in the past. It is one that until now, at least, and the jury is still out, we have always overcome. So it's worth thinking, I think, a bit about the ideology behind this bill and behind MAGA Republicans. And that is, if you think about the world, there's two ways, at least in the United States, to think about the relationship of people to their government. One is simply to say, well, some people are better than others. They're smarter, they're richer, they're the right color, they're the right religion, they're the right gender, you could come up with any reason you would like. They're married to the right people, they're descended from the right people, to say that some people are better than others. And if you admit the principle that some people are better than others, well, by definition, they should be able to rule. And that's the idea behind kings. And that's the idea behind oligarchies, a group of people organizing a government to rule everybody. That's the idea behind dictators. And that's the idea behind autocrats or authoritarians, that they're just better than the rest of people. And ultimately, if some people are better than others, it makes sense that one person is better than everybody else and has the right to rule. And that is, as I say, the ideology behind Hitler, the ideology behind somebody like Vladimir Putin, the ideology behind dictators, sometimes the ideology behind kings in the 19th century and before that. It is also the ideology behind human enslavement in the American South and in the parts of the United States where indigenous Americans were enslaved. In the American West, for example, the idea that, those people do not have the ability, the religion, the gender, the color, the whatever, to participate in their government, and they must be ruled. And that is, I think, what you're increasingly seeing. I mean, this has been the argument on the radical right now since at least the 1950s. But you're really seeing that play out here with this idea of imprisoning people right now, largely people of color, but it's going to expand if history is any judge. But you're also seeing it with Trump saying things like he's going to let some farmers keep the migrants who have been working there undocumented for 20 years because those are the good ones. And that those, they'll look out for those people. And that is quite literally what enslavers and then unreconstructed Southerners said about Black Americans or Brown Americans in the American South and in the American West in the late 19th century. I mean, it's literally the exact same language. But we're in a really different place in this moment, in that in those eras, because the people who had been enslaved, discriminated against, kept down because of their gender or whatever, had really never had opportunities. It was possible to construct a worldview in which you could say, well, those people can never learn because it had been illegal to give them education. But we in front of us in the United States today have literally, since the 1970s and the after the programs of the Great Society go into place in the mid 1960s, seen a world in which racial, gender, religious, ability, I said gender, I think I've whatever, any religious, I didn't say that, minorities have been able to demonstrate their equality, which I think is one of the things giving such fangs to MAGA is that, I saw recently Charlie Kirk talking about how Ketanji Brown Jackson was a DEI or a civil rights hire. And if you've read anything by Ketanji Brown Jackson, she's brilliant. And, she's done all this amazing stuff. And Charlie Kirk dropped out of community college in his first, I think it was his first semester. And it's basically just a grifter, a shit poster. I'm sorry. Somebody who just says horrible stuff. And faced with the reality that people who are not white men are in fact equal and sometimes, quite frankly, more than equal. What you are seeing in this moment is the attempt to erase our history, to erase Harvey Milk's name off a ship, Harriet Tubman's name off a ship, to erase the women who worked worked in intelligence, to get rid of the history of the Black and brown and gay and female and whatever people who built this country. And I think that recognition, you can look at the enslavers and the unreconstructed Southerners and recognize that they are worried that maybe they're not going to always stay on top of things. But I think you look at this moment where they're not simply preventing people from getting rights. They're trying to erase all that, says they recognize that they have to erase us all in order to regain control of the country. And I think that is what we are seeing now. That recognition that that people really are equal, and they've got to erase those, throw us out of jobs, throw us out of the country, get rid of us all in order to, they can't do it without doing that. They can't regain control of the country unless they shut everybody else up, because we really can do it. The other ideology speaks to reality, to the reality I just described. It says that everybody is created equal and that the government has a responsibility to protect that equality, to make sure everybody is treated equally before the law, that they have equal access to resources, and they have a right to a say in their government. And that's what really reflects reality. The idea that, it doesn't necessarily, your contribution to society does not necessarily correlate to your paycheck. That, maybe you're the person who, checks on the little old ladies in your town, even though you're not, a wolf on Wall Street. And that recognition that that's the way the world really works is the ideology that stands against that idea that some people are better than others. And the reality is the vast majority of people in the United States believe that. And what's more, we have proof that this country does best when the government acts on that. Quite literally, this is what the US government did after 1933 when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected and took office. And it's the world that we have lived in since the 1935 Social Security Act, which provided the basics of a social safety net for those people who were destroyed in our trade-based economy if they were injured or if they were widowed or if they were children who didn't have parents and so on. So if you look at how the United States functioned under that system from 1933 to 1981, it had a booming economy. It had the difference in poverty rates was declining. The opportunities were increasing. People were getting education and so on and so forth. And that's what the Reagan Revolution stopped. And we are now seeing with this measure the ultimate attempt to destroy that government and take us back to a world where a very few people will rule. But we have added in this moment this extraordinary deficit spending, which, you know, in the 1920s, they never would have done when they were living like this. The Republicans simply would have balanced the budget. I mean, the crazy thing here is what you're seeing is not a return to the 20s even. What you're seeing is essentially open looting. And that is going to be really important. And I'll tell you more about that in just a second. So you should be angry about this bill. You should be incredibly sad about this bill, as I am. But again, I'm going to emphasize that all is not over. And here's why I say that. I looked up the numbers because one of the things that really gives me hope in this country is that it's a really big country. There are 334 million of us in this country. Actually, I think it's a little low. I think there's more than that. So people make comparisons of where we are right now to Nazi Germany. And Nazi Germany, I looked up the numbers, had 67 million people in 1933. That's a much smaller country. And we're a much bigger physical country as well. And we have a federal system in which we have a number of democratic states led by democratic governors who are pushing back against the measures that this bill and that the Trump administration are trying to put in place. So one of the people I'm watching very closely is J.B. Pritzker in Illinois, who is, running a pretty tight ship up there in terms of taking care of the people in Illinois and protecting them from ICE and creating essentially an image of what the government can be. But he's not the only one. There are a number of Democratic-dominated states, and it's going to be more difficult to create a juggernaut of the United States as a fascist system than it is a smaller country. Now, there are the other piece of this, of course, is that the Trump administration is just wrecking the economy. They are wrecking the economy. And a lot of people have said that this bill, with its unaddressed extraordinary deficits and then debt, is going to hurt that even more. And, you know, people like me are very concerned at the degree to which Trump is invested in cryptocurrency. And cryptocurrency really pays off if the dollar is devalued, which it seems he's working to do. So that's another piece that's out there, but there is hope within this. And that is that all of these measures are deeply unpopular. They're not unpopular among a very small group of people. They're deeply unpopular, not only among poor people who are hurt by them, or people who care about social welfare and social justice who are hurt by them or hurt by the fact their neighbors are being hurt. But when you look at the destruction of the US economy, you're also hurting entrepreneurs, you're hurting capitalists, you're hurting people who really voted for Trump or supported Trump or didn't vote for the Democrats because they didn't like the idea of the higher taxes that first President Joe Biden and then Kamala Harris said that they would put in place. They wanted this tax cut. They wanted another tax cut. Well, that now is but they've also got along with it what certainly appears to be the real instability in the economy, the tariffs, the crush, the hits to the dollar, Trump's attack on the Fed, and so on. So there is room here for the kind of coalition that threw out Herbert Hoover and replaced him with FDR. And I see the language of someone like FDR. I'm not making this explicit comparison. I'm looking at the language of through somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the representative from New York, or Mamdani, the Democratic nominee for New York mayor. So that language is starting to be out there, and there is room to build that coalition. But as I say, we've got the issue of this new ICE police force, which is terrible. And we should be speaking out against it, because this is quite literally one of the things that the colonists of the King George III spoke up about and created their own nation to get away from. And here we have it. There are people pushing back against that as well. The courts, most of all, of course, but people speaking up really matters. So what do you do in this moment? First of all, it is worth continuing to call out the facts. And, one of the things I saw today was somebody said, I'm thrilled with this bill because I've been really heartbroken about the debt that the US is carrying. And now finally, Trump is taking care of the debt. He's taking care of the debt by exploding it. This is somebody who has been paying attention to right-wing media and paid no attention to the actual facts. And you know what? There's nothing we're going to be able to do about the mainstream media or right-wing media except use our voices to establish what the facts are and to say, no, actually, this is what the bill really does. And you know what? You're never going to get your MAGA uncle to believe you, but you might get somebody who doesn't pay much attention to the news to believe you. And my friends at Red Wine and Blue have an entire website now helping you talk to people about these issues to spread reality. It's also worth recognizing that the things in this bill and the things that it will do are enormously unpopular. And by that, I mean, Americans overwhelmingly care about addressing climate change. That's out the window. We overwhelmingly care about taking care of our seniors and the people on Medicaid. They're going to be hurt, but here's another one that people aren't really talking about yet, but I don't make predictions about the future, except in this case, I'll do this. The corruption that this bill sparks is going to be enormous. There's a huge amount of money in this bill that is designed to go to ICE. It's designed to go to that wall. It's designed to go to all these places. And I would make a bet right now that a lot of it is going to go into MAGA Republicans' pockets, the same way that we have discovered so much of the money for Iraq under George W. Bush went into people's pockets and so on. Americans hate corruption. That's going to be something really to continue to call out. But in addition to that, it's going to be important for those of us who are able to protect the people who are hurt by this bill. And I mean primarily people of color, Black Americans, but certainly brown Americans, who are the ones who will pay most dearly for this bill. And in that demographic, I'm looking at my peeps, older white women. We are the demographic in the United States that is least likely to be imprisoned and least likely to be hurt by ICE. That's not to say we can't be. So take care of yourself, take friends, learn how to do the kinds of protests that are going to be happening safely. But I got to tell you, young men of color all the time say to me, should I be out in the streets? And my answer is always, I should be in front of you in the streets, because this is kind of our time. And we can protect those people, and our demographic can protect those people more than a young Black man can, because he's in the line of fire. So try and protect the people who are going to be hurt by this bill. There's going to be a lot of them. And the other thing that I'm really going to emphasize again is to work at the local level. And I wanted to leave you with a sign of hope in working at the local level. If you remember, Back a million years ago, but it was only March, I think. Remember when billionaire Elon Musk went to Wisconsin and wore the cheesehead hat and all that because he insisted that the election for the Wisconsin Supreme Court was the fate of humanity hung on it. I think he said the fate of Western civilization. And the Republicans lost that seat by a lot of points. I want to say 12, but it's been several months, so I could be wrong about that. Well, just 2 days ago, because there is now a liberal majority on that court, and remember, liberal does not mean democratic, although in this world it sort of does. Liberal means a group of people who believe that the government has a role to play in regulating business, providing a basic social safety net, promoting infrastructure, and protecting civil rights. You can disagree within those things, but you say there is a role there. MAGA says there isn't. Those of us who think there is can be Republicans, independents, Democrats, Greens, whatever, but we believe in that liberal idea that the government has a role to play in protecting the individual from big business, from poverty, from the things that will stop an individual from being able to make the best of her or his life. Just a couple of days ago, that liberal majority on that Wisconsin court, so that was a local race, it was a state race in Wisconsin, overturned a 176-year-old law that banned abortion in that state. They moved the ball back to where it was before MAGA took over. And that's a step in the right direction. Wisconsin, of course, the reason that Musk thought the fate of Western civilization hung on that is Wisconsin is a gerrymandered state, or has been a gerrymandered state, and this court will almost certainly uphold fair maps. So working at the local level, and I would say working at the local level to protect the right to vote, to get rid of gerrymandering, and to protect the right to petition your government, which a number of states are cutting back on as citizens are demanding abortion rights, for example, or demanding fair maps, is very important. But working at the local level, making connections at the local level, working at the state level, and recognizing that this is going to be a long haul is going to be really important. But it is worth remembering that that is how a bunch of colonists who didn't even speak the same freaking language. I mean, people forget that because we've so whitewashed our history that everybody sort of thinks that everybody in the 13 colonies running around were all speaking English. No, they weren't. I mean, even where I am, people up the street spoke German. And spoke German, by the way, into the 20th century. And, people were divided by language, they were divided by religion, they were divided by wealth, they were divided by education, they were divided by any number of things. And a lot of them looked at their neighbors and thought, we need law and order because we don't want to deal with that dude. And the more that the neighbors talked to each other and explained that if you have a government that is unchecked by the people, you all lose your rights. They brought those people together to do something that was astonishing, which was to declare that people had the right to consent to their government and to have a say in it. And that everybody under that government, and of course, they were only talking about men at first, usually men of property, but it was a concept that was expandable, that everybody in that government was created equal. Under that government was created equal. And the fact that they did that at that time in such a small group of people, under that kind of pressure, and they took on the most powerful empire in the world at the time, I think, it looks bad right now. There's no doubt. But if you think about that, and you think about the Civil War and how the regular people took that back, and you think you took back the democracy then. And if you think about how Americans took back democracy against the robber barons and against those people in the 1920s who were organizing as Nazis, don't forget that, in the 1920s, and how they, with that power, broke the stranglehold of the essentially neo-Confederates on the American South that they'd had since 1874, that by 1965 we had the Voting Rights Act. We're not in a good place right now. But this I can promise you, if we do not stop this drift toward authoritarianism or fascism, which are slightly different. I'm such a pedant on that. I think we're in authoritarianism or competitive authoritarianism, but other people say fascism. I promise you, neither one is good. If we don't step up, each day is going to get harder and harder. And it is going to go, whatever you think you can't imagine now is going to be here if we don't stop this. And, the thing is, it sucks. I'm with you. It totally sucks. This is not how I wanted to spend my 60s, let me tell you. But we don't really have a choice. And you think about everybody's lives. You don't get a choice of what gets thrown at you. You just got to deal with what it is. And this is what it is for us right now. And the thing is that with our numbers, our education, our skills, our coalitions, we have an extraordinary advantage that the people who came before us didn't. So I know today has been miserable, but I'm not ready to give up yet. And the thing is, I guess that even if I were, we don't really have a choice. We really have to keep on going forward. Just like Harriet Tubman said, the only way out is through. So take whatever time you need to mourn today. We did know it was coming, but recognize that nothing really has changed in terms of resistance, except that we just today got a whole lot of people who didn't realize they were part of the resistance yesterday to join us. So on that note, do the best you can with 4th of July. There is a lot to celebrate, even though there's a lot we can't celebrate. And I will pick this up next week. Thank you for being here. And we are dropping, just so you know, we're dropping a video about 4th of July, probably in a couple of hours. And I hope you will share it far and wide, because I think it kind of addresses this moment. Thank you for being here. I'll see you next week. Hey folks, I'm seeing some messages here on the comments of people from Grapevine, Texas, where I was last year. So hi to you. I hope you find each other. It's not that big a town, but it's fun to see you here. I wonder if I met you when I was down there. I'm going to say, oh, Waldoboro. Hey there. How are you? Michigan. It's moving a little fast. Santa Barbara, Connecticut, Iowa, Norton, Mass. I know Norton really well, obviously. Never been to Nampa, Idaho, although I have hiked the Sawtooths. Beautiful. Lodi, California, Canada, Concord, New Hampshire. No, Concord as well, of course. South Carolina. I wonder where you're from, Katie. And Des Moines. Best pastry shop bakery in the world in Des Moines, Iowa. I'm sorry, it's one of my favorite places. All right, let's see if when Facebook gets on here. Nobleboro, how are you? Alberta, Manitou Springs, Colorado, Naperville. I grew up in Wheaton, was born in Aurora, Marshall, Texas, Willamette, Austin. You're not the only person from Idaho, Kristen. Louisiana, Pittsburgh. Facebook is on. Super. Thank you very much. All right. I'm going to jump right into things today. Everything's happening, right? And we're all incredibly confused. But I'm going to start someplace where you did not ask me to start, because I feel like this illuminates a lot about American history and where we have been and where we are today. And that is, I'm going to start by telling you that Zoran Mamdani is, I can never say that. For me, the N's and the M's are reversed. Zoran Mamdani, there we go, is not a socialist, and he is not a communist. That matters simply because he is a democratic socialist, which is not the same thing as a socialist or a communist. And I'm going to lay this out here because a lot of Republican rhetoric for the last 40 years, and even before that, has centered around the idea that Democrats are communists, and that has really poisoned our political discourse. A communist and a socialist, they have differences within them, but they are people who want the state, the government, to take over the means of production so that you have a state centered economy in which the state determines how the different businesses operate. That is not at all what Mamdani is trying to advocate. And that is a world in which we haven't gone so far that a very few people dictate the terms of our economy. He is recognizing that a lot of what's happening in the United States. Hold on. Um, something has, is that me or is that somebody else here? Um, it may be that it is. Hold on. Sorry about that. I have all my tabs open to write tonight, so that one started talking at me. Um, what he is doing is he is picking up the language and the frustration of people who are not served by the current system, and he is calling for a democracy that more fully serves the needs of the American people. And that's not the same thing as wanting to take over the means of production. Now, the reason I just made a big deal about this, because he is, after all, simply the Democratic candidate for New York mayor, the mayor of New York City, which he doesn't have a lot of effect on most of us because he's mayor of a city in which a lot of us don't live. The reason I mention that is because Donald Trump today, Donald Trump being the president of the United States, came out today and said that if Mamdani was elected, that he would consider taking over New York City and then he added on taking over Washington, D.C., because we would not have a communist in charge of any place in America. And what this does is it encapsulates where the parties are and where rhetoric is right now over our political system. That is, the Republicans have insisted since at least the 1980s, but it goes before that as well, that anybody who is advocating a government that regulates business and provides a basic social safety net, promotes infrastructure, and protects civil rights is socialism or communism. And that idea is just simply wrong. It comes in the United States from a much earlier period in 1871, when after the Civil War, unreconstructed white Southerners insisted that letting Black Americans, Black men at that point, vote meant that they would vote for things like roads and schools and hospitals. And those would be used, of course, by white Americans as well as Black Americans. But what they said was those things could only be paid for by the tax dollars that came from people who had stuff. And the only people who had stuff were, after the Civil War in the American South, were white guys who had land. So they insisted that any kind of legislation that benefited ordinary people would require a redistribution of wealth, and that in itself was a form of socialism. Now, that's not what became international socialism at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, but those who objected to the idea of a government working for ordinary people insisted that anybody calling for that was a socialist, and then after the rise of international communism, a communist. And that has been this like swear word in America against people who want education and want medical things funded and want roads and want, scientific research and want things like that. And the fact that Trump is doubling down on this and saying that Mamdani is a communist, which is what he said today, is a reflection of this older rhetoric. And it also, the fact that he said that he would consider taking over New York City, even if Mamdani is elected, that is in a democratic process, and consider taking over Washington, D.C., shows where the MAGA Republican Party has gotten to, which is that even if a whole lot of Americans want something, if the Republicans disagree with it, it can't be allowed. And that's a really important snapshot, I think, to have to answer the rest of your questions today. So where we are now, I think, with the MAGA Republicans is with this idea that only they are the people who can exercise governmental power in the United States. Anybody else is illegitimate. And, I've talked in a lot of places about how that came to be, how they came to make that argument. But we're in this moment now where we have in the political system in Washington, D.C., a lot of people who are not very good at what they do. They insist that any Democrats who were in office were there simply because of civil rights legislation or because there was, favoritism, or they were just collecting a paycheck, and they are truly the ones who should be in power. But what we're seeing is they don't know what they're doing. And this was illustrated very clearly today at a meeting in which there were reporters present and the cabinet members were all around the table. They're off in the room where the cabinet meets off the Oval Office. It's a very small room, by the way. And a reporter asked President Trump about the Russians' use of chemical weapons in their war against Ukraine. And Trump very audibly turned to Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who is a former Fox News Channel presenter, next to him and said, do you know anything about this? And Hegseth said to him again audibly, not really, but maybe John Ratcliffe down at the end of the table has some idea about it. So Trump threw it over to Ratcliffe, and he gave a very boilerplate answer about how the use of chemical weapons is a war crime, and we wouldn't agree to that, and so on and so forth. But if your president and your Secretary of Defense doesn't know about something like that, that's not a vote in their favor in terms of their awareness of what's going on around them and going on in the world. That idea is important in this moment because in many different ways now, we are seeing the rhetoric of the Republican Party, the idea that any kind of government that serves ordinary people is un-American, is socialist, or is communist, is now sort of coming home to roost, because we are watching all these different ways in which the MAGA Republicans are destroying the modern state. And as they do so, we're seeing the extraordinary damage from that. So one of the things that happened today was that the Supreme Court agreed that the Trump administration could make massive cuts in the US government while litigation is ongoing about whether or not those cuts are legal. And this is one of the things that the administration has done, is it simply changes the facts on the ground, even though they certainly seem to be illegal, so that by the time somebody says, whoa, doggies, you can't do that, it's too late. The things have already changed. And this is certainly what will happen in this case if they continue to make all these cuts. It doesn't matter if at the end of the day, the courts say, no, you can't do that, because those people have already been cut. They've already gone on to other things. Those parts of the government have already been slashed. And that's reflective, I think, of this current Supreme Court, which is a MAGA court and which does insist on the idea of a unitary executive, a very strong president, and the destruction of the legislative body of Congress. So, which is what passes the laws to put pieces of the government in place. So that right there, I think, is a sign of this idea we could just simply cut government, and that should be okay. But what we are seeing is from the cuts in government and from the attacks on that modern state, really disastrous situations. So yesterday, a series of major medical organizations, including all of the biggies, launched a lawsuit against Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., because he's changing up the vaccine schedules that he promised he would not in order to get confirmed by the Senate. And we have the biggest measles outbreak across the country right now that we have had since the measles was actually declared eradicated into the year 2000, as I recall. And this measles is just spreading, and he is now saying he's going to look at all the vaccines that have been approved all these years, because he doesn't trust. He's not a doctor. He's not a member of the medical personnel, and he has investments in alternative medicines. He doesn't believe that those vaccines are safe, no matter what the medical community says. And by the way, no matter what the historic community says, because those of us who study America and other countries as well know that vaccines vaccines were freaking game changers in terms of keeping children alive. They just are. And if you don't believe me, go to any graveyard from the 19th century, and you'll see whole families there of families that simply got wiped out by diseases that are now treatable through vaccines. So people are responding to those sorts of cuts, but the obvious one that is making such a difference right now is that horrific tragedy in Texas. And just as an aside here, I want to remind everybody that one of the critical pieces of a government that functions is it protects its children. That's like governance 101. You keep your children safe. And what has happened in Texas is horrific. It was sort of a perfect storm on a number of different levels, terrible things hitting in the middle of the night, and so on. But right now, as of 6 o'clock on July 8th, 111 people are dead and more than 160 people are still missing. And we are increasingly learning about the many ways in which Republican governance, not necessarily the Trump administration alone, but the cuts from the Trump administration that slowed down communications between the weather forecasters and the local emergency notification systems, as well as the fact that the state of Texas decided not to put in emergency warning systems because they felt that it would be too expensive. That FEMA, I believe it was in 2018, said that they would not, under Trump in the first term, said they would not invest in emergency warning systems in that very flood-prone area of Kerr County, Texas. Those things are coming home to roost now, along with the fact that FEMA is being caught. You know, the idea among the Trump administration people is that FEMA will be a state level emergency response system, which is, the whole point of FEMA, the federal emergency management agency, was that it was kind of insurance for all the different states, that when you needed help, there was an outpouring of money for you. And when somebody else needed that help, you could contribute to that. They're trying to turn that back into a state-based emergency response program. And right now, as of today, according to Marissa Cabas of the Handbasket, there are only 86 members of FEMA that have been deployed, even though Trump declared that area of Texas in a state of emergency on Sunday. And if you think about the ways in which the MAGA Republicans insisted that the Biden's people weren't responding quickly enough when they were boots on the ground, like within hours of any disaster, I think what you're seeing is the rhetoric of, you communists, you socialists can't do anything right, and we can because we know what we're doing. And Americans are now discovering just what happens when you get rid of the professionals and the experts and the bureaucrats who actually know how to do stuff, and replace them with people who look the part. And it's very clear that the Trump administration is working very hard to look as if it is very effective. They seem to be focused primarily on appearances, on the way they look in front of cameras. I'll talk more about that in a second. And that might play very well, certainly around election time. But when people need help or they need some kind of intervention by the government, you're not going to care what your defense secretary looks like or the Secretary of Homeland Security. So we're watching this idea that a government that works for everybody is somehow socialist or communist, and that we really need to do is put MAGA people in charge so they can make cuts and they can shrink the federal government. We are in real time watching what that means. So the other thing we've got going on here, of course, I think since I last did one of these, is the passage of the budget reconciliation bill. And that cuts about $890 billion, as I recall, that might be an earlier number, from Medicaid. It does so beginning after the midterms, but we've already lost at least 2 smaller hospitals because they have projected out that they will not be able to continue to function because they will not be able to get Medicaid reimbursements. And we're also seeing the massive cuts to Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which currently 42 million Americans rely on at least some payments from SNAP. And that's about 22 million households. This is not a few people. And I would I would lay money that every single one of us on this particular webcast knows somebody who either is on SNAP or has been on SNAP. And those are all people who are now facing the reality that, sometimes people need assistance and they're not going to have it. And what does that mean? What is that going to mean for the country? All right. So, one of the things that this has meant for the MAGA Republicans is that the way the Republicans have sold this idea that anybody who wants the government to respond to ordinary Americans is a socialist, is by insisting that those people who want those things are un-American, that they are the other. They're the people, for example, that Rush Limbaugh used to call feminazis, or people who are Black or brown or are religious minority or a gender minority or have disability issues, or some ways in which they recognize that the government should respond to ordinary people, to a community. And one of the things that the Trump administration has done is really double down on that idea that those people are the other. They are un-American. And you see the taking of names off of ships, for example, and the erasure of women's work in the intelligence community, and the idea of firing people in the military who are women or Black or brown or transgender or gay. I mean, there's all these ways in which they are othering those people. And as their administration continues to crumble, as it is, the doubling down on that is giving us these demonstrations of extraordinary dehumanization and cruelty toward the other. And there are many ways in which you see that. The sneering. I mean, for me, it's of everything, it's the sneering at the incredible cruelty in which they are engaging. The photo ops in front of men in cages, the laughing at the idea of Kilmar Abrego Garcia and the many other people who were rendered from the United States to El Salvador's CCOT terrorist prison, as somehow kind of a joke, is a way to dehumanize those people and to accustom white Americans to the idea that this is okay, that this is fun, that this is funny. And I've seen it, I don't know about you, I have seen it on social media from people who are like, liberals have no sense of humor, this is funny. And it's not funny to me. And I'm disgusted by people who think it is. And disgust might be too weak a word for the way I feel about people embracing this. But you see this really dramatically in the idea of setting up the concentration camp, because that's what it is in the Florida Everglades for undocumented immigrants, that has gotten a cutesy name, that again, the government agencies are actually circulating pictures of alligators wearing immigration customs enforcement hats, as if, and Trump has talked about how, people are going to have to learn to run away from alligators. It is worth remembering that we are the United States of America, and our leadership is acting as if this is A-okay and B funny. And that dehumanization is not just that they are sick. It is also a way to make Americans used to it, so that we think this is fine to treat other people that way. And it is worth noting that today there was a piece in the New York Times, I think, about how the person really calling the shots in the White House appears to be Stephen Miller, who is the anti-immigrant person in the White House Deputy Chief of Staff. But the reason that I'm emphasizing this is because, let me add one piece to it. The attack yesterday of a number of agents from a number of different pieces of the government on MacArthur Park in Los Angeles was a really, really interesting occasion, because they did not have a specific target and they did not arrest anybody. That was a demonstration of state power, both to instill fear into the people that might feel that they are at risk from the state, but also to instill fear in white Americans, to make them feel like they don't want to be on the wrong side of that regime. They don't want to be on the wrong side of the state militia, the state, now that's the wrong word, the state police that we now have with ICE and that we will see increased thanks to the budget reconciliation bill, which puts $170.7 billion into immigration, deportation, and housing, and enables the hiring of about 19,000 new ICE agents. What they are doing with that othering is not so much to gain control over those marginalized populations, although they are suffering terribly, but to gain control over the rest of the American people. And that's something really important to remember. That's how authoritarian governments take power, is they attack weaker people in order to get control over everyone. And you can see this, I think, in a number of ways just today. The administration knows it is deeply unpopular and that its measures are deeply unpopular. So what are the things we're seeing? We're seeing things like the IRS telling churches it's okay to endorse certain candidates from the pulpit, which is, almost certainly a signal to evangelical churches which support Donald Trump in I believe it's in the 90% range. It's a signal to religious groups, that right-wing religious groups, that they can endorse candidates. And it's a really important marriage of religion to politics, which is a hallmark of fascism. So that's you can see the ways in which this administration is trying to shore up its base because it knows how wildly unpopular it is. Now, you asked a couple of questions about that. First of all, you asked me to tell you how Marines, for example, feel about being deployed against the American people. And I don't know, I'm not a Marine. I will tell you, I read military.com, Stars and Stripes, and one other one every day. And their reporting certainly suggests that they are not at all happy about this. Those are free, all of them. You have to sign up, I think, for military.com. But if you're interested in the military, they're a good place to start. There's actually quite a good reporter at military.com. I always try and read. And you also asked me about Ketanji Brown Jackson, the justice, the most recent justice on the court, and what I think of her. I am really impressed by her, not just because of her mind, which is honestly kind of a no-brainer. She's brilliant, but because one of the things that she is doing, and I know her well, but not as well as I would if I could do a full dive on everything she's written, which I haven't really had time to do. She is really advancing a new kind of intellectual legal argument for American jurisprudence. So you have a court that's been dominated by what's called originalism. And that's completely crap as far as I'm concerned for historical reasons. But in the present day, originalism was developed in the 1980s to push back against what right-wing Americans in general called judicial activism. And that was the idea that judges were enforcing civil rights around the country, things like Brown versus Board of Education that prohibited segregation in the public schools, all the different ways in which the courts were advancing civil rights. Right-wing people who didn't like that said, well, courts can't do that because they're not elected. Justices can't do that because they're not elected. And they have to go back to what the original meaning of the Constitution was. But then it turned out very quickly that, in fact, the right-wing justices were inventing their history, and they were inventing what the original meaning of certain laws was. So Justice Jackson is taking a look at the entire Constitution and standing very, very firmly on the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which is part of the Constitution. By the way, tomorrow is the anniversary of the ratification of it. And arguing that its deliberate construction of the idea that state governments, as well as the federal government, have to obey the Bill of Rights and have to protect the rights of citizens within states is central to American jurisprudence. And that is, I think, right. And I think it's, if you think about the ways in which there's a wonderful article, it's a bit of a rabbit hole, I guess, but there's a wonderful article by Chief Justice, I think it's Stephen Breyer, talking about um, the fact that being a Supreme Court justice is hard. I mean, how do you don't take easy cases generally. And how do you decide what is right when you've got 250 years or thereabouts of law and precedent and interest and this and that? And what he argued was that you needed to weigh both sides equally, and if you came out equally on both of them, you should come down on the side that advanced democracy, which is an answer. It's maybe not the answer, but it's an answer. I think Justice Jackson is making the argument that you should come down on the side of civil rights because of the 14th Amendment, which I think is far more interesting than the idea that you should simply go with whatever your colleagues say people wanted in 1802 or 1803, which is largely presentist and made up. I'm sorry, that was a bit more of a rabbit hole than you probably wanted. Anyway, so you have, as I say, in this moment, this attempt of the Trump administration to demonstrate that it is in power, even though it is really not. It's enormously unpopular. The Republicans are really not able to get much done. They're a Trump party now, and and Trump himself seems to be slipping mentally. And there's a lot going on in that party that does not indicate that they are really going to be able to nail to the wall their attempted authoritarianism. So that brings up the last question here. You asked two more questions I can get to here. You asked me about cryptocurrency and what's going on with crypto. It is really, I read a lot in crypto. I don't really understand it, but I read there a lot. It's really important to remember that Trump was essentially broke. End of discussion. Until he got into crypto. And there's been a number of wonderful pieces on this in the last week. He got into crypto. Crypto has basically been a way for people to funnel money to him. But one of the things you need to remember going forward is that cryptocurrency pays off only really if the dollar declines in value. And if the dollar declines in value, that's financial manipulation, and that's a huge, huge problem for the country. But when, Trump is trying to say, oh, it'll be great if we, start switching over to cryptocurrency, that is entirely about him making a lot of money. And there are many arguments for what crypto is good for and what crypto is not good for, but I would be very leery anytime Trump starts to push crypto because that's the only place he's got money coming in right now, and because it is more valuable. The less valuable dollars are, the more valuable crypto is. And you also asked about. Let me finish with that, about the debt and what about this extraordinary debt that we're taking on because of the budget reconciliation bill. And the answer to that is that we have taken on up to $5 trillion more dollars of debt, and that debt is not going into reinvesting in the American people. It is providing tax cuts for the very wealthy. So we're essentially borrowing money to let rich people get a lot richer. And economists, if you're following this at all, are very, very concerned about this, because it's one thing for a country to go into debt when it needs to, like when there's a crisis, a war or a pandemic or whatever. But there's no reason for us to be taking on that kind of debt in order to provide tax cuts, which is what we're doing. And that's deeply problematic. And you've asked if the midterms are going to happen. I don't make predictions about the future, but I will tell you, speaking up about them is enormously important. I think the midterms will happen. The question is whether or not they will have so suppressed the vote in Republican-dominated states that the outcome will be preordained. So, big thing to speak up against gerrymandering. All right, but here's where I wanted to leave this. I have just painted a picture for you of a world in which the rhetoric of a generation of Republicans that anybody who wants the government to work for ordinary Americans is socialism or communism. And now we have this sort of mythological group or people who are running the country according to this mythological idea that if you get rid of that government altogether, everybody's going to do just great. And what we're seeing instead is that We're losing scientific research, cancer research, climate change mitigations, weather research, vaccines, the education. The administration said it was going to stop funding for public education, that had the grants that had already actually been promised. We're seeing all this stripped away, and I don't know how Americans are going to react to all that being stripped away. I know that we got the government we have because Americans wanted it. There's a reason that nobody wanted to make these cuts before Trump, and the Supreme Court gave him the power to avoid prosecution for breaking the law, because they said, we want a president who's willing to do stuff that probably he couldn't get away with otherwise, which is crazy if you think about it, but that would make sense with this Supreme Court. So what do we do? I mean, one of the things that always worries me is when people feel helpless, because there are 334 million of us. We are not helpless. And in this moment, speaking up is crucial, not just because of the moment in which we find ourselves now, but also because there are a lot of people currently running for office, and the people in office now will not live forever. And the people running for office need to know what we care about, and that we will turn out to support them if they embrace the ideas that we care about. So speaking up now could not be more important. And what I mean by that is this. First of all, at the local level, I've mentioned this before, but in a number of states, the Moms for Liberty candidates in the last election lost their races for school board, getting rid of the sort of crazy right-wing stuff that they were putting through at the local level. At the state level, Wisconsin got rid of the 176-year-old law banning abortion because of a state Supreme Court election. That election mattered a lot. And one of the things my friend Tom Nichols always says is that what the Republican advantage is over Democrats is that Republicans get out and they vote for everything on the ticket. And Democrats don't do that because they either think it's not important, or they think they need to research the candidates better, or whatever. But in the case of that Supreme Court election in Wisconsin, electing a liberal onto that Supreme Court made the difference for abortion rights in Wisconsin. So focusing on the local level and the state level matters a lot. But here's what also matters: talking to people, making sure people hear what you care about, what the cuts that we're seeing around us are going to do, but also what world you want, because we're not just fighting against something, we're fighting for something. And the ways you can do that are myriad. But one of the things that is not the way I work, but the way other people work: short videos recorded on your phone and posted to social media, really effective. And as part of that, the other thing that is really effective in changing the way people think about a government is art. I just cannot emphasize that enough. Graphic art, primarily, things that people can look at quickly and absorb very quickly, photographs, things that you can look at and get the message. Like I'm keeping a record in the letters I write for the future. But let's be honest, a lot of the people we need to reach are not going to read me. And I now have this wonderful woman cutting my stuff down to make it easier to share, which is fabulous. But that will never, ever have the impact of a really powerful poster. And having that sort of art out in public, showing people that that's what you believe in, is really important. Music is really important. Protests are going to be really important. Showing people that this administration does not have the power that it is trying to illustrate is going to be incredibly important going forward. So the other piece of that is recognizing that when people understand what the administration is doing and what it means for us, they oppose it overwhelmingly. The problem is an awful lot of people don't understand what's happening, and they're not paying attention, and they don't care about politics. Those are the people that need to get engaged going forward. Those are the people we need to reach, because there's an awful lot of people who are sitting there saying, How bad can it be? The country's been around here for 248 years. We've always survived people in the past. We now have, as I said, concentration, one concentration camp at least. We're working with others in other countries. And what a concentration camp means, by the way, I said I would explain it and I didn't, is it is literally a concentration of people. So they're pushed together. And that almost always means that the sanitary conditions and the health conditions are very poor, which we're already seeing, by the way, in that Florida detention facility. But it also means that they are people who are outside the bounds of legal recourse. That is, they have not had due process. They are not covered by the law. They are often far away from other people, so they can't, people don't examine what's happening to them. And they are sort of deliberately put outside of sort of everyday society. And that's absolutely what's going on in the Everglades. So making sure that people know this is happening and that you don't support it. I'm telling you, you show up around me saying it's funny that we're setting alligators on people. I'll judge you, let me tell you. And people should know that this is not acceptable behavior. So although it is frightening out there and there's a lot to be scared of, one of the things I keep saying to everybody is we don't have a choice to face this or not. The only way out is through, which, by the way, I believe is something that Harriet Tubman used to say when she enabled enslaved Americans to make their way to freedom. None of us wants to do this. I promise you, I would so much rather be writing my next book and kayaking and baking and knitting than doing what I'm doing now. But we don't have a choice. So we need to bring our A game. And the great benefit of that is we get to do it together and we get to learn new things and meet new people and learn new languages and help to create a much better world. And in that, we're all doing it together. So frustrating and frightening and sort of depressing as it is to be watching what's going on around us, the flip side of that is that this is a time of extraordinary possibility. And the piece that we need to bring to that is recognition that we don't support what's going on, but also a vision for the future. And we will not agree, which is fine. But we need to bring a lot of ideas to the table so that people recognize there's something on the other side, something to work for, something that we can put into place. And that we can all do. So I hope that cheers you up a little bit about where we are. And I hope that was somewhat coherent. I'm actually trying to talk to you and write the letter sort of at the same time. So maybe I covered too much in funny ways, but I hope that helps in any case. And I will see you on Thursday. So thank you for being there here and hang in there. I said before, and I meant it, it's going to be a bad summer. And yet it's July 8th and we're still here. So let's just take the bit in our teeth and go for it. Thank you for being here. Hey folks, Rhode Island, Minnesota, Indiana, Pennsylvania, Colorado, California, New Jersey, Ohio, Nevada. There's the first repeat. California, Missouri. I'm laughing because I'm 15 minutes late because after doing that video yesterday where I'm like, you can do the social media. Don't worry. It's easy to figure out the whole thing. I could not get my laptop to do anything I wanted it to do. So I had to turn it off and figure out what was going wrong. It just never quits, does it? Washington, Little Rock. You know how I feel about Little Rock. I made a wish in Little Rock once that came true. I'm still living on that wish. North Carolina, Myersville, Maryland. We're waiting here on Facebook to kick in. Wheeling, Illinois. That's an interesting one. Canada. Michigan, Shenandoah. Oh, what a beautiful part of the country. St. Paul, New Mexico. I hope you guys are doing all right. And lots of floods in New Mexico too. Lawrence, Kansas, and Facebook appears to be here. Minneapolis, Asheville, South Carolina, Los Angeles, Lebanon, Connecticut. All right, I think Facebook is here. It's funny because you're not showing up as if you're here, but it says you're here. So, okay, there we go. All right, I realized today that I always ask for questions on Tuesday because I sort of don't know what's on people's minds, but I haven't been asking for them on Thursday because by this time of the week, it feels like the story of the week is pretty clear. At least it seems that way to me. So if you want me to ask more, I will on Thursdays, but I just had no doubt what I was going to talk about today. So let's dive into it. Really interesting week that we have had here. And if you think about it, what has really jumped out to me, so I sat down this morning to take notes, as I always do, and I had 3 single-spaced pages of notes about stories from the last 2 days that I thought were important that people should know. 3 singles, and these weren't paragraphs, these were jotting down notes. And as I looked at them and began to group them into different pieces of a story, it did seem to me like there's a pretty clear story, at least for this week. And that is that if you think back to last week, a week ago today, July 3rd, the House passed that budget reconciliation bill. And it was perceived in the media and certainly among MAGA Republicans anyway, or many MAGA Republicans, as being a great moment of triumph. Certainly President Donald Trump perceived it as a moment of triumph for the Republican Party and for his plans. But this week seems not to have played out that way. In fact, it seems to me anyway that there has been quite a strong and widespread snapback to the passage of that measure, which was passed so quickly and almost without debate, and which cuts nearly $1 trillion from Medicaid and cuts SNAP benefits, this Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and cuts energy credits, which are going to make electricity more expensive, and pours about $170.7 billion into immigration and immigration policies, immigration and customs enforcement. People seem to be pushing back, and not just against the bill, many of whose provisions aren't going to take effect until after the midterms. As somebody said, if it's such a great bill, how come you're putting some of the real major pieces of it off until after the midterms? And why did you pass it in the middle of the night? And I think those are questions worth asking. But what happened is Trump signed that bill on July 4th, 4th of July, in this big ceremony that most of us missed because we were hanging out with our families, or whatever one does on the 4th of July at your house. I was with my family. Big holiday here for us. But that's the same day that those flash floods hit Texas, and in the center of Texas. And one of the things that's been interesting to watch this week about the reaction to those floods is they are, first of all, an extraordinary tragedy caused by a storm, an act of God. And yet there were enough human slip-ups in that moment, coming as it did, when it did, that it really put the Trump administration on their back foot. So what I mean by that is we are very aware, and this is really not negotiable, that climate change is dramatically affecting the intensity of storms around the world, but certainly in the US. And that, by the way, is something that climate scientists have always said was going to happen. People who represented climate change as, remember the senator from Oklahoma holding a snowball on the floor of the Senate and saying, see, there's no global warming. Climate scientists have always said that what climate change would do is it would intensify storms and it would intensify patterns. And that's exactly what we've seen. And we should expect intense storms, increasingly intense storms going forward until we really take on the crisis of climate change and work to mitigate its hardest edges as we go forward. But the storm, intense as it was because of the changes that we are experiencing, coming again right after the Trump administration had slashed all of the ways in which we're trying to address climate change, that itself was a problem. But the other things that happened and the way they happened have played out. And I sound like I'm a bit uncertain here, but that's because in my mind, what is playing out is not only the present, but also the reaction in 1900 to the Great Galveston Flood, which it was also in Texas and had a very similar feel to it, to me anyway. Watching the way people reacted to the Galveston Flood and now watching the reaction to this horrific event in Texas, there really is a historical echo there. So what happened in this storm was that the storm hit in the middle of the night, and there was flash flooding and extraordinary flash flooding. And this is something about growing up and living near the water is people who live near the water have a very, very healthy respect for the extraordinary power of water. And we don't, sometimes we worry about people coming from away who think that, that waterfall is just really cute and they're going to swim over it or whatever, and they get hurt. Growing up, knowing people who drown and all that, you recognize water is the most powerful force in the planet. And in this case, the Guadalupe River rose, I believe it was 29 feet in 2 hours. So imagine what that looks like, 29 feet in 2 hours, and what that damage was going to be. Well, immediately out of the box the next morning, as people are still missing, local officials blamed the National Weather Service and said, well, this is the federal government's fault, because again, in Texas, the inclination to blame the federal government for anything is pretty deeply ingrained and has been since the 1980s, really, that this is the federal government's fault. The National Weather Service didn't tell us that this was going to happen. And very quickly, National Weather Service people, both there and retired ones, said, hey, wait a minute here. We did report this, and we reported it as accurately as it was possible to do. It wasn't our screw up. So people started looking into how the news of the dangerous flood had spread. And what they discovered was the National Weather Service had, in fact, given multiple warnings about this storm. But the local officials had not transmitted those warnings for almost 4 hours, which in a storm like this, one of the horrific things, of course, is that the storm, the river crossed over a girls' camp, a Christian girls' camp. And again, hideously, sadly, one of the dorms, everybody survived. But that's not the sad part. The sad part is that another dorm that was only a quarter of a mile closer to the river lost a lot of little girls. So the minutes really mattered. It's only a quarter of a mile, and they didn't make it to safety. The people a quarter of a mile further inland did. And that's, it's just heartbreaking. But anyway, what people discovered was a couple of things. First of all, they discovered that the person at the National Weather Service, who was the person who interfaced with local officials, had taken early retirement because he'd gotten pushed out by the Department of Government Efficiency, and they had never replaced him. So all that institutional knowledge, whom to call, that they trusted him and so on, that was gone. And at the same time, they also found that the county had, in fact, applied for a $1 million grant to install warning sirens in 2018 and had been denied that grant. They'd thought about putting in sirens on their own, paid for by the county, and they decided it wasn't worth spending the tax dollars. So they had that behind them. And then what we learned yesterday was that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, which is exactly what it stands for. It's the federal agency designed to respond to storms or to emergencies, couldn't respond until Monday. The flood was Friday. They couldn't respond until Monday, more than 72 hours after the flooding began. And normally, in the past, FEMA gets to a storm ahead of time so that they can do search and rescue, so that they can provide water, they can do whatever needs to happen. And I wrote about that a lot during the Biden administration because they were actually quite good about it in the Biden administration. And I remember at least once writing about literally how they stage an area before an emergency situation happens. But they couldn't do that because Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem recently put in a rule that because she is determined to save money, that any expenditure more than $100,000, she had to sign off on personally, and she did not do that. She said that this was not FEMA's job, that the state should take care of it. And I actually pulled a quote here. Her spokesperson said that FEMA is shifting from bloated DC-centric dead weight to a lean, deployable disaster force that empowers state actors to provide relief for their citizens, and said DHS is rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse and is reprioritizing appropriated dollars. Secretary Noem is delivering accountability to the U.S. taxpayer, which Washington bureaucrats have ignored for decades at the expense of American citizens. So the fact that there was, 72 hours before there was search and rescue is also a part of this extraordinary tragedy. There are more than 100 people who have lost their lives and 160 people still missing. And I, the would-have-beens, could-have-beens, are haunting. But this was on July 4th, right after the passage of this bill that was supposed to be such a big triumph. But then, and one of the reasons, of course, that Trump wanted that bill passed when he did was because the Department of Homeland Security, again, Kristi Noem, has run through its budget, and they needed the extra funding in that budget because they really weren't going to be able to operate until the end of the fiscal year, which, by the way, is illegal. You're not supposed to run through your budget that way in the federal government, but they did. Speaking of waste, fraud, and abuse. And they needed that extra money. But the other thing that was happening immediately after the passage of that bill was that, if you remember this, and you may not because so much has been happening, but if you remember when Trump did his Liberation Day, in quote, air quotes, tariffs of April 2nd, the stock market dropped more than $3 trillion over the next day. And when the bottom seemed to be falling out of the economy, he stepped back and he said, okay, I'll do a 90-day pause. Well, the 90-day pause was yesterday. It was July 9th. And at that point, unless countries had made bilateral deals, that is between the U.S. and them, bilateral as opposed to unilateral with everybody, bilateral deals with the U.S., those really high tariffs were supposed to snap back in place. But it was pretty clear from what happened in April that those snapping back into place were going to be an economic disaster. So after when all this was transpiring in April, and again, you may not remember this, but what Trump and his people said was, we're going to negotiate all these tariff deals right away. We'll get them all right away. And then we can get rid of these Liberation Day tariffs, which were really random. The formula they used, Peter Navarro apparently came up with it, one of Trump's trade advisors. And it was it used this formula that was laughable. And so the idea was to renegotiate with trade deals with all these other countries. Have you noticed all the news about those trade deals? There have been almost none. So all of a sudden, without any of those trade deals, Trump was looking at putting those Liberation Day tariffs back in place. Well, on Tuesday of this week, when everybody was focusing on the flood, he put on Truth Social that he was putting the tariffs off again to August 1st. And he also very weirdly said August 1st was always the date. I don't know where that came from, because it wasn't. The date was July 9th. But he said it was always the date, and it's not going to change again. I am going to put those in place. And he sent a number of letters to certain countries to say, now's your chance. You have to negotiate, or else I'm going to slap you with some incredibly high tariff. And he also put a really high tariff on copper coming to the U.S., which is deeply problematic for the U.S. economy, because copper is in an awful lot of stuff, and copper's expensive anyway. But copper is, we can't really live without copper. And we did used to have copper mines, but we really we can't produce our own copper any longer in the amounts we need. So that kind of came out of the blue. But that whole slapping on of these, the tariffs came due is basically where I'm going with this. And the tariffs coming due are a huge problem, both for the United States and for the Trump administration, because if you remember, Trump insisted in the campaign of 2024 that he was going to bring in all this money through tariffs, and he was going to pay for his big, beautiful bill with these tariffs. But what he simply refuses to acknowledge, maybe he doesn't understand it, is that it's actually people in America who pay those tariffs. They're not paid by foreign country. They're paid for in America. And so those tariff things snapping into place are enormously threatening to the to American consumer, who already is mad. I think I just looked at the numbers a few hours ago. I think it's 50%, 57% of Americans disapprove of the way he's handling the tariff. And that's a lot. That's cutting close to 60. I'm sorry, the way he's handling the economy. If you add on to that rising prices, which we're already seeing on toys and clothing, which come from China primarily, that's really deeply problematic for this administration. So you've got this big, beautiful bill, and then you've instantly got this demonstration that the ideology under which the administration is working has not been able to respond to this horrific tragedy in Texas. And on top of that, you have the tariffs coming. And then on top of that, there has been this brouhaha over the fact that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth stopped shipment of weapons to Ukraine, apparently without telling Trump. Or telling the White House. A lot of people were blindsided by that. And when asked about that, Trump keeps saying, well, the first time he was asked about it by a reporter, he said, I don't know who made that call. You tell me. But it's sort of not in a I don't know kind of way, but kind of like throwing it back in the guy's face. Somebody asked again today, and Trump kind of answered with word salad, saying, well, if the decision made, I would have made it, but I didn't do it. So the decision wasn't made, but we know the decision was made. So one of the things that you are seeing is this breakdown in the administration of the space around Trump. So there was an article in the New York Times a few days ago about who actually is wielding power in the Oval Office, and saying, it's not Kristi Noem, who defers to White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller. He's the immigration guy. And it's not Susie Wiles, the Chief of Staff, who is the person responsible essentially for creating a reality TV show every day. She's the one really behind making sure that you can't look away from this administration, stay tuned for what he's going to do next. And that means, and it's not Attorney General Pam Bondi, who, according to this article, is interested primarily in her appearances on Fox News. So the person really in charge there is Stephen Miller. Well, one of the things that you'll see here, though, is all those names I just mentioned, as these sort of bombs drop in the inner circle, they're unhappy with each other. This is not a well-oiled machine. This is not people who get along. They're backbiting. Stephen Miller is famous for turning against people and bad-mouthing them to Trump so that they get fired or they get shoved aside. And you've also got in that the reality that you saw with Secretary of Defense Marco Rubio, which is, if you remember right now, Marco Rubio has 4 jobs. He's the Secretary of State, which is a full-time job and a half. He is a National Security Advisor, which is a full-time job and a half. He's the National Archivist, which is a full-time job at least. I'd add at least another half. And then he is, I can't even remember the 4th one. It's important, whatever it is. You and I couldn't do those 4 jobs at once. I mean, I couldn't do any of them, but you couldn't do all 4 of those jobs at once. But one of the reasons that Rubio is doing all those jobs is because nobody wants to work in that White House. And similarly, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth fired a ton of people, if you remember. They can't get anyone to take those jobs because nobody wants to work in that White House. And now, yesterday, I think it was, if you remember when billionaire Elon Musk left the White House, one of the first things that happened was his pick to run NASA, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, I think, to run NASA, his pick, that they yanked that nomination because with Musk out, they yanked his friend's name out of that nomination. But they haven't been able to find anybody to put in his place. So yesterday, Trump announced that to run NASA, which again is a huge organization and it takes real skill and real knowledge, he is nominating Sean Duffy, who is the Secretary of Transportation and who also comes from a reality TV background. So you've got this sort of cesspool where nobody wants to work and they're sniping at each other. And Trump is sort of in the middle of it. And according to Jeffrey Epstein, who did a number of interviews about his relationship with Trump, why that has not gotten more traction, I have no idea. He said this was Trump's MO. He'd like to keep people around them and keep keep them riled up. So they were always jealous of each other and always trying to fight for control of more and more space and for more access to Trump. And that certainly seems to be what's going on. All right. So in the midst of all that, then you've also got real pushback against the raids that Immigration and Customs Enforcement are engaging in. And those raids, at least the one in MacArthur Park in Los Angeles, appeared to be mostly for show, to demonstrate that the Trump administration was going to feel comfortable smashing into Democratic-dominated states and Democratic-dominated cities. Now, there's been another major raid today in California. I have not stayed on top of it because I've been doing other stuff. I will be on top of it by tonight. But one of the stories that has come out recently is that ICE agents themselves, who at least some of them think of themselves as the good guys, are hugely demoralized because while they were told that they were going to be going after criminals and rapists and so on, and where they really did used to go after drug smugglers, that was really their big MO. Now they're just going after people who've been here in the country, sometimes legally for dozens of years, and who are grandmothers and who are, children. And that's not what they thought they signed up to do. So the administration also has that to deal with. So interestingly enough, what I think I'm seeing anyway is a couple of things. The first is to stop thinking about the administration as having a plan to govern the country, because they're operating according to an ideology that explicitly does not govern the country. And instead to look at things like this announcement of this extraordinary tariff on copper as potentially money-making opportunities for people around Trump. And there's at least one venture capitalist who has been watching the buying and the selling of stock and of precious minerals, for example, around the tariffs and saying, guys, this is not okay, what's going on over there. And you can also look at the ways in which the Trump family seems to be trying to cash in on as much money as they can while he's in the White House. We got these Trump perfumes, which is a branding opportunity. And we also have the Trump switch into crypto. And recently, and I'm sorry, I've just lost track of days, but within the last day or so, Trump's media empire, that's the one that oversees Truth Social, has never made any money. It's really always operated in the red. It is switching into crypto as well. So you've got Trump really shifting a lot of weight and putting the weight of the US government behind crypto, which to me, again, as a late 19th century person, really raises red flags about the manipulation of currency, which is really complicated, but rarely turns out well for the average person. And that's something that I'm watching very closely. But what has jumped out today to me, or the last couple of days to me, is something that's really worth watching carefully. And that is that as this ideology that the MAGA Republicans brought to the White House and to Congress seems to be unpopular, what I feel like I am seeing is the administration taking all the power it can muster and throwing it at those people who are opposing it in order to try and climb back up to having the upper hand. And my examples of that are first of all, something that got very little press, which surprises me. And that is that Vice President J.D. Vance gave a speech over the weekend at the Claremont Institute, which is a right-wing institute, but one with very different roots than he expressed on Saturday. And that speech has gotten a little attention, as I say, because of his attempt to redefine what citizenship should mean in the United States, the attempt to get away from the idea that anybody can be an American so long as they believe in the idea of equality before the law and democracy, a right to a say in your government, and a right to access to resources. And instead to say citizenship is about the land and about your longevity on the land, which is entirely different than the United States has ever embraced. Other countries do, some other countries do. The United States has never done that, and it was a very J.D. Vance kind of sleight of hand, to be honest. He's known as a debater. He's a really slippery guy, but make no mistake, that was a rejection of our history in favor of a sort of European idea that you need to belong to the land, which I may write about at some point because it's so antithetical to anything that we have stood for in the United States ever. And interestingly enough, it's also antithetical to what the founder of the Claremont Institute believed, but that's neither here nor there. I'll keep you out of that rabbit hole. But he didn't get to that argument until far into his half-hour speech. The first part of the speech is just like Trump was saying the other day when he said, Democrats hate me and they're un-American and they hate America and all that. That's the kind of language that J.D. Vance was using. It is completely wrong. It is completely wrong, but it is pretty clearly designed to whip up his supporters or MAGA supporters against opponents of the regime. And it was deeply disturbing. And again, I didn't have time last night to pull a transcript of it, but it's a speech that should not fly under the radar screen, coming especially from the man who insisted that it was okay to lie that immigrants were eating pets if it accomplished his end. And that was really, really, really disturbing. But that's not the only place that I have seen that. You can see Trump's people using the power of the government to punish their opponents. They are now saying that they are launching investigations into James Comey, for example, and James Brennan, the head of the CIA and the FBI, who followed up on the ties of the 2016 Trump campaign to Russian operatives. You have seen them in the ways in which they are going after Democratic lawmakers. You've seen it in the way they're going after Democratic cities. There's a lot of places in which it looks like MAGA Republicans and Trump and his administration are trying to whip up hatred against their opponents, because their opponents at this point, by the way, are not just Democrats. It's Democrats, it's independents, and it's a lot of non-MAGA Republicans saying, hey, I did not sign up for what I'm seeing in the streets with ICE going after people. There was a representative who just wrote something incredibly hateful about a Democratic representative on social media the other day, and it's the kind of language that historians look at and recognize is on the path to ethnic cleansing and genocide. And it's a really red flag for us. I remember the first time that I noticed it being used by the Trump administration was in the first term, and it was Don Jr. who was talking that way. To see it coming from the president and the vice president suggests to me desperation, but it also suggests to me something we really need to be watching very, very closely. Now, why might they be so concerned? And why might they be rolling this out? As I keep saying to you, people who are in control do not have to behave this way. You know, if you are confident in your power, you do not have to attack your opponents. You're comfortable that you can win on the merits, that you are popular, that you don't have to engage in this. Well, you're seeing more and more, I think, people pushing back against the Trump administration. So we have a number now of um, government agencies pushing back against him, people within them pushing back against him. Today, the National Science Foundation says it will not join, but it will imitate doctors and members of different agencies who have written open letters saying you're destroying our government and we're not behind this. Interestingly enough, yesterday, a Catholic bishop in Los Angeles told the faithful that they no longer had a holy obligation to show up for Mass out of concerns about ICE. For a Catholic bishop to absolve and maybe that's the wrong word. I'm sorry, I'm not Catholic and I don't get all the words right necessarily, but to say you have a number of holy obligations in the Catholic Church and to say we can skip on the whole going to church thing until this ICE thing is taken care of is really astonishing. There were at least 3 articles in the New York Times today talking about how badly Trump's economic policies are hurting the country, including a number of major agricultural producers who were Trump voters who are instructing their not undocumented workers, their fields are 80% full of undocumented workers, how to hide essentially from ICE. And people who supported Trump saying, I'm distraught about the economy. You're seeing things like Senator Tom Tillis, who has said after the fight over the budget reconciliation bill, that he's not going to run again. And he is now speaking out to say, we're in a really bad place with Trump. This is not a good thing. And you're seeing also at the federal level, courts pushing back against Trump to the point that today, a federal judge in a class action suit stopped Trump's birthright citizenship executive order, saying that children of undocumented immigrants born in the U.S. are not birthright citizens. This is going to be in the courts for a long time, but that's a major, major loss. So one of the things, again, to be watching is this pushback against Trump. And then finally, the fact that the administration and MAGA Republicans are very, very concerned about how unpopular you can see by the fact that they are trying already to change districting in Texas to make it more likely that Republicans can win in Texas because they're so unpopular, they're afraid they're going to lose there. Similarly, they're trying to get the voting rolls in Minnesota. There are many ways in which you can see them really already saying, hey, we're in trouble because people don't like us so much. So it's been a funny week in that, like I suspect many of you, are heartbroken over the budget reconciliation bill that just slashes through the modern American government that we've had since 1933. And yet, as soon as that was signed, it was almost as if there was this entirely new chapter that said, this is the government that they are putting in place. And it is not responding in a proper way to a horrific tragedy. And then you saw this sort of all the pieces of what's going wrong with this administration, the tariffs and the economy that seems to be in trouble. And now Trump is screaming about how he's got to replace the Fed and it's the Fed's fault. And he inherited economic growth of 2.5%, and now it's actually negative for the first quarter in the U.S. I mean, you're seeing this stuff kind of begin to crumble, and as it crumbles, you're watching the administration fight amongst itself, but you're also seeing it trying to use the power of the government to push back against its opponents who are growing by the day. And you're also seeing them trying to cement their power by changing the rules of the vote. So it's a funny kind of snapshot week for me. And we'll see where it comes out. But I think I got all the major playing pieces in there. And I hope that made sense to you. Because to me, it's been a puzzling day. As I say, with that 3 pages, I'm like, what's going on here? And I tried to make sense of the 3 pages. And that's what I came up with. So what I would leave you with today is a number of things, the same things I always say. Push back at the local level, push back at the state level, talk about what's important to you, which by the way, I might not agree with, and that's fine. That's how democracy works. Speak up about the things you care about. Speak up on social media, in your towns. Somebody said to me the other day that that Trump had brought in $88 billion through his tariffs. I'm like, I don't know where you're hearing that, because we pay the tariffs. And this was news to this person. After all these years of us talking about tariffs, this person did not know that tariffs are paid for by the people in this country, not by other countries. So that was a learning moment, I think, for both of us, for different reasons. But push back on that. And, one of the people I work with said to me something today, having watched me on Tuesday, I guess it was, me emphasizing music and especially art and especially memes. And it's very clear in this age of social media that memes, the things you put very quickly on social media, are hugely influential in changing the way people think. I'm not good at that. That's not my sphere. I'm the long record keeper. Everybody's got a role to play, right? That's mine. But this person said to me, and I'm embarrassed to say I didn't think of it before, please do those things. Please do your recordings, speak up about why the government's important to you, what you would like to see from it, all those things. Certainly make art posters, things that people can see and react to. But as she said, if you put it on social media, tag me in it. Don't put me on the poster, but if you tag me in it, I can share it. And that's a no-brainer. That's how you share things. And so I've been madly over there, as I said in that video before. I'm not really great at this yet, but I've been on social media. I look for this stuff every day, and I do repost it all the time. But it never occurred to me it'd be a lot easier to repost it if you tagged me in it, so that we would know it was there and we could go ahead and move it forward. So I hope that gets you through the weekend anyway. I'm not going to be here this weekend. We got a family wedding. But I hope it gets you through the weekend and lets you know that for as much horror is coming at us all the time, if we stick together, if we help out our Black and brown neighbors who are under threat from ICE, if we try and create the community we want to see, the die is not cast at all yet. And I would much rather be speaking the truth about America and the truth about community and the truth, I think, about human nature than by trying to support this current administration, because we can do a lot better in this country than we are doing. And I think a lot of us are speaking up about that. And the more we hold together, the better our chances will be. So anyway, thank you for being here, and I will see you next week. Take care.